Okay, hello. Welcome to On Neuro, the live online neuroscience and psychology conference. I am Paul Scotti, and I'm joined by my co-host.
Hi, I'm Molly McKinney. Today, our presenter is Mrinmayi Kulkarni. How's it going, Mrinmayi? Could you tell us briefly about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I work with Dr. Debbie Hanula. And our lab generally looks at the interactions between long-term memory and attention. So we're looking at how regulating attention during encoding allows for better memory, and then also how items in your long-term memory are able to capture attention. So that's generally kind of what we study in the lab. And today's paper is only tangentially related because it has a component of long-term memory, but I think I chose this paper because the method that they use is really cool.
Do you personally use fMRI or modeling approaches?
I do use fMRI. So our lab uses behavior, eye tracking, and fMRI. So far, all of the stuff that I've done with fMRI has been fairly normal, nothing out of the ordinary that this paper has attempted, but I'm hoping to start doing more multivariate stuff. So maybe someday.
All right, very cool. Thanks again for joining us and volunteering to present. I thought that we'd start off by briefly talking about a paper that we came across last week about split brain patients before we get into the presentation. It came out a year ago, but I think that the results are not common knowledge, so I thought that we could talk about it. For those who are unaware, split brain phenomenon, it refers to cutting across the corpus callosum, the brain region that links the left and the right hemispheres. And without the communication between the hemispheres, it's possible for one half of the brain to perceive and process information that the other half is oblivious to. And that can lead to things like presenting a sign on the left visual field to pick up an object like a Rubik's Cube or something. And the right hemisphere receives that information and directs the left hand to pick up the cube. But if you were to ask the person picking up the cube why they were holding a Rubik's Cube, they wouldn't be able to tell you because verbal processing is done in the opposite left hemisphere, which hasn't received any information about the cube.
Yep, so some people might interpret this to mean that there are essentially two conscious and independent processes acting at the same time or with the same body. And this can lead down a long road of philosophical questions, but what the new paper is suggesting is that split brain findings have not been so clear-cut, partially because they have been very few past studies that were qualitative reports, and they were all qualitative reports. So here they had two split brain patients take part in a series of tasks similar to the one that Paul mentioned about the Rubik's Cube, and they found that the left hemisphere actually did receive information about the object presented on the opposite visual field. In addition to a host of other tasks involving motor and verbal responses, they failed to find any evidence for the spooky split conscious phenomenon.
Yeah, so I think that if people did know about the split brain patients, they would have, it's often taught that it's this weird phenomenon of two consciousnesses essentially acting independently. And this paper is going against that, but there are some curious results, such as how patients did still show impairments when told to compare information presented between the visual fields. And there's also the question of how did one hemisphere at any point receive the information from the other hemisphere if there was no structure to support the transfer of information. So one possibility is that there are other structures that carried information between the hemispheres, like the anterior commissure, or that some structures were developed over time to help carry information in a different way, such that, like through plasticity or something, given that the patients did have time after they were operated on. There were months that went by after their operation until the tests that they were given. But in terms of philosophy of mind, it's as if the brain hemispheres were processing independent information, and yet the conscious self reporting to the outside world was somehow always in agreement, both physically and verbally.
Hmm. That's interesting. So, do you have any thoughts about that, Mrinmayi?
Yeah, so it kind of goes against everything that I've read, and also taught this semester. I just realized, but so um, so I've always kind of imagined that the findings so far haven't been as kind of extreme as they are depicted to be in these popular science articles. So for instance, the stimulus is presented for a really short period of time in order to prevent information transfer through these smaller structures like the anterior and the hippocampal commissure. So I just assumed that. Yeah, this is interesting though. Do they speak about why this happens? That is why, or I guess their hypotheses about how it is possible that they have a sort of united consciousness, even though kind of sensory information is processed differently.
Yeah, they don't really go into specifics about why. All they seem to be doing is reporting the past literature and reporting the effects that they observed and how it's inconsistent with prior reports.
I mean, is there any possibility for something like you said that you take away the stimuli before it's possible to get through those smaller structures, but is there any just like sort of reactionary process that's going on? So like maybe it's sort of random which side is going to react to the stimulus that's in front of it, and like maybe there's some, I don't know, like autonomic physiological structure that's just responding to the fact that there is a stimulus in front of them at all.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go into the specifics of like stimulus duration or anything, but one of the things that they did was, they're reporting whether through motor movement and through verbal output, whether people can express awareness of an object that's presented to one or the other side. And they also have confidence ratings about how confident are you in your yes or no, basically. And so if people were less certain perhaps on one hemisphere than the other, then that might suggest that there's maybe some information, but not all information that's being transmitted. But it seems that people were highly confident even when they were being tested on the hemisphere that didn't receive the visual information. I guess it's also important to talk about how this is only with 2 patients. So there might be a lot of individual differences that we're not aware of too.
That's also because it's similar to all of the blind spot studies where they presented stimuli in patients' blind spots and asked them to report kind of basic physical characteristics like is it a vertical line or a horizontal line and so on and so forth. I don't remember if they had confidence ratings, but they found that even though they couldn't consciously see the lines, they were able to say whether it was a vertical or a horizontal line, essentially. Because of the sort of leftover pathway that goes through the superior colliculus. So I should mention that this is blind spot that occurred after damage to the visual cortex. So the pathway up to the visual cortex or through the LGN was intact, but the idea was that the smaller pathway going through the superior colliculus was able to accumulate this information and report sort of basic things about the stimulus. So that's what this kind of also reminds me of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there are a lot of parallels between the two. And you would think that similar to like a blind spot, or people might be able to respond in a way but not be aware of it, and that's where the confidence ratings somewhat elucidate or give some insight on.
Oh, that's interesting.
Anyway.
Well, as much as we could talk about this all day.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because, I mean, it was published a year ago, but I haven't really heard much about it.
Is it an ongoing study?
I don't
gathering
think so.
More data from more participants?
So one of the hard things about split brain patients is that they're becoming harder and harder to come across. I think that the procedure itself is becoming outdated, and not many people get a full corpus callosum transection anymore. So this might be one of the latest papers that have patients like this.
Does it have to be from a surgical procedure, or could it be from like a clinical? Yeah, clinical. It's
possible that it could be due to some other lesion or a stroke, but then it wouldn't be as isolated.
But then you may end up with other confounding situations as far as how to interpret.
Yeah, it would be difficult to get a very clean. Simply a cut along the corpus callosum without having effects possibly explained by other things that also happen due to the result of a stroke or some other problem.
Fascinating. Surprised our audience hasn't asked questions about this one here.
Yeah. People in the chat, also, please let us know if there are any issues with the video or audio, or if the levels are okay. Just so that going forward, things are in the best quality. Anyway, without talking too much about this article, I want to get into the real meat of today. So, Mrinmayi, you can open up your PowerPoint, and I'll switch windows over here.
Can you... Yeah.
All right, and let me go full screen, and then you can take it away.
I think we might have lost Paul for a minute.
Oh.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, I've switched the windows.
Beautiful.
Okay, I'm going to turn up the audio a little bit. Thanks, chat. Okay, Mrinmayi, you can go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
All right. So like I mentioned, this paper is kind of sort of a little bit about long-term memory, but it's mostly looking at how the brain processes events and how that's different across the kind of cortical hierarchy. I am going to try very hard to keep this under 15 minutes, but it's a really complicated paper, so I might go slightly over. Feel free to ask questions, and I'll try my best to address them at the end. So like we know, visual or sort of any kind of information in life is a continuous flow of information. And the idea is that the brain is able to chunk this incoming information into small finite pieces. Sorry, I think the stream is slightly behind. There we go. Okay, sorry. So the brain is able to chunk this information into smaller and finite pieces in order to process the information. And this paper kind of this group essentially puts forth an event segmentation theory, according to which the brain is kind of continuously accumulating cortical representation of incoming information in a way that each area is trying to sort of chunk information based on its particular function. So the visual cortex is going to chunk incoming information based on its kind of physical characteristics. And as we go higher in the cortical hierarchy, the chunks are going to become sort of longer and more kind of event-like. So the theory kind of puts forth 6 hypotheses or 6 tenets, which I'll go through very quickly. The first one is that the event boundaries are hierarchical, so shorter timescales in the sort of lower level visual and auditory areas, and then longer timescales in more higher order regions that are sort of removed from processing purely sensory information. The second hypothesis is that there is correspondence with human annotated boundaries in these higher order regions. So in the higher order regions, the way these regions chunk in incoming information is very similar in sort of time scale to how we perceptually understand events. The third hypothesis is that representations at the top of this hierarchy are similar across modalities. So it doesn't matter how you perceive a particular event, whether a story is kind of narrated to you or whether you watch it in a movie, the representation is of that event is going to be the same in these higher order regions, regardless of the sensory modality. The fourth hypothesis is that the end of an event should trigger hippocampal activation, such that the event at the end of the event, the hippocampus is upregulated in order to consolidate this event into long-term memory. And then hippocampal activity is also required for reinstatement of that event. So when you think back to an event, you once again see an upregulation of the hippocampus. And then the last hypothesis states that prior event memories are able to affect ongoing processing. So if you kind of come across the same, if you're watching the same episode of, I don't know, your favorite show again, you know what's going to happen next, and the prior memory of that event is going to affect the processing when you're watching that episode in this time. So the study and the method kind of addresses all 6 of these hypotheses, and hopefully it will become a little clearer as we go through the data. But very briefly, the model that they're using is a variation of a hidden Markov model. And I'll briefly describe what that is, but the basic outline is this, that for one, there are 2 assumptions that in a continuous event, like the episode of your favorite show, there are a number of hidden states or events that the brain is kind of encountering or chunking. And each of these events have a distinct neural pattern. So the event kind of manifests itself as a neural signature in different parts of the brain. I just want to point out over here that when I use the word event, it's not kind of how we usually understand it. It's more kind of talking to the chunking of incoming information by different brain regions. So an event for the auditory cortex is going to be very different from an event for the posterior cingulate cortex, for instance. So I just wanted to make that distinction really quick because I will be using the word event a lot. So the idea in the methods they've used is to divide the data into these events in different brain regions that show a stable activity pattern, where the boundaries of these events are set at points where the stable neural pattern shifts and moves to the next stable pattern. And then once you've essentially derived these event signatures or neural signatures, you can use these signatures to on a different data set in order to predict the event patterns in a different data set. And then finally, these event transitions can be used to also study other processing activity in the rest of the brain that is associated with the end of an event and the beginning of a next one, for instance. And we'll see an example of this when we look at the hippocampal activity. So essentially, the hidden Markov model is trying to estimate the latent state of where each time point corresponds to a particular event, and all the data points during that time have a really high correlation with a kind of neural signature or the manifestation of that event, essentially. So hopefully all of this will become a little clearer as we go along. So just briefly, they had 22 participants and a variety of different data sets. It's a little unclear whether the same participants did all of the conditions here, but that's not really crucial to essentially understanding what they did. One data set that they have is essentially with 18 subjects listening to 2 interleaved stories, and they switched between the stories every 60 seconds. So what this gives you is a data set where you essentially know where the story is switching. So when one event switches into the next event. They also had 22 subjects who watched an episode of Sherlock, the BBC series with the wonderful Benedict Cumberbatch. So they were just lying in the scanner and watching for 50 minutes, watching an episode of Sherlock. And then this was followed by free recall. So they were just asked to recall the episode that they watched in as if they were kind of telling the friend the story of the episode. One of these audio narrations were used as were also played to a different set of subjects. So there were 17 other subjects who just heard this audio description without watching the episode first. And then there were also 17 subjects who watched the episode and then heard the audio description. So this kind of varied data set is just going to help them get at all of their 6 hypotheses, and we'll see how they do that. Just quickly, I have a list of ROIs over here where they restricted their model, and in parentheses, I have how all of these ROIs were parcellated. So they have some early sensory areas, but then also more higher order regions. And then finally, they had a couple of participants come in and watch the show outside of the scanner and write down time points at which they perceive an event transition. So an event transition is essentially defined as when the audience thought that there was a change in theme. So the location changed, or the actors or the characters changed, or something like that, just to look at how we perceptually classify events, and then also how it's done in these different brain regions. All right. So they use this event segmentation model, which is a hidden Markov model. So the Markov model essentially has 2 components. Before I go into that, I just want to briefly describe just very generally what a Markov model is. And I found this example in a YouTube video I watched recently, which illustrated the point very well. So imagine that you have a friend who lives far away from you, and this friend is likely to be very happy when the weather is sunny, and is likely to be grumpy when the weather is rainy. So since this friend lives far away from you, you don't actually have access to what the weather in his location is, but he is able to tell you what mood he is in. So essentially your job is to identify the latent state, which is the weather in that place, based on whether your friend tells you that he was happy or grumpy on a particular day. So imagine that your friend tells you that in this week he was happy, and then grumpy again. Typically, just based on kind of Bayesian statistics, you would presume that it was highly likely that it was sunny, rainy, sunny, and then rainy again, given your observation of your friend's mood. But then the hidden Markov model also kind of extends this by taking into account what they call a Markov chain. So essentially a sequence of events which in which a particular sequence is more likely than another, for instance. So in our example over here, it's unlikely that the weather is like randomly switching from rainy to sunny to rainy to sunny the other day. So the hidden Markov model is going to take into account not just the friend's mood, but is also going to take into account previous states of the weather in order to predict how likely it is for the weather to be sunny on a given day. So it's going to use the information that your friend was happy on a particular day, but also use the information that it was rainy on the previous day. So what is the probability that it is sunny today, given that it was rainy yesterday, and then also that your friend is happy, for instance, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So in our case, the Markov model has a state kind of event structure, which is essentially the likelihood that at the next time point in your fMRI time series, a new event is going to begin, right? So imagine that you have t time points. This event structure is kind of formalized as a transition matrix where all right, I'm just waiting for things to come up on the screen, where the rows are the current state and the columns refer to the subsequent state. And everything else in this matrix is 0 except for the diagonal, which refers to the state at the next time point being the state at the current time point. And then also the off diagonal, which formalizes the probability of the next time point being the next event as compared to the current time point, right? So in our case over here, this cell, sorry, I'm just waiting for things to come up on the screen as I'm pointing to it. There we go. So in our example over here, this particular cell is 0 because we are in event 3 at the moment, and we can't go back to event 2. And then this cell over here is also 0 because we are in event 2 and we can't transition to event 4. So the probability of transitioning to event 4 from event 2 is 0 because we need to pass through event 3 first. So this is how the event structure is kind of formalized in this model. And then apart from the event structure, we also have an observation model. So that's your fMRI time series. And from this, you have a probability estimation of essentially what is the likelihood of observing this particular bold signal if we are at a particular event K, right? So these are the two kind of components of the hidden Markov model. The algorithm essentially iterates between the events, estimating this transition matrix, and then going back to the observation model, kind of estimating the probability of observing a particular bold signal given your event structure or state event structure. And then from this, what you get is a set of event structures corresponding to each event in your each event in your data set. So say you have K events, you get event signatures ranging from M1 to MK, where M1 is essentially your fMRI times is essentially kind of the sum of the time series weighted by the probability that you are in state number 1, whereas M2, which is your event signature for your second event, is weighted by the probability that you're in event number 2, and so on and so forth. So these M1 to MK are essentially the neural signatures that you get corresponding to each event that you are looking at. So they validated this. So essentially, they validated this model using that first data set that I told you about, where the stories were switching, or the narration was switching between 2 stories every 60 seconds. So they used the posterior cingulate cortex ROI and they applied this event segmentation model and identified time points at which the event was switching or in which the neural signature was switching between events. And what you're seeing on this graph on the x-axis is the time points from the story boundary. So time points from the 60-second boundary between the stories. And on the y-axis, you have the event boundaries that were identified by the Markov model. And you can see that there is a high amount of correspondence between the actual story boundaries and the ones that are identified by the Markov model. So now going on to the 6 hypotheses. So now that they know this model kind of works, they went on and tried to validate the 6 hypotheses that they had identified. So the first hypothesis essentially was that there would be finer event timescales in sensory areas and coarser event timescales in higher order regions. So the way they did this was by taking their entire data set and applying the event segmentation model in different ROIs to a subset of data set, leaving one subject out, so that you get your event boundaries. And then you use these event signatures M1 to MK and apply those to the subject that you had left out in order to derive the event boundaries in this subject that you had left out, right? So based on 16 out of your 17 participants, you derive your event signatures, apply those to this left out subject in order to identify event boundaries in this subject. And then what you can do is find correlations between time points and then group those based on whether they fall within the same event or across different events. And then you can kind of get at a fit or how well your model is describing the data by calculating the difference between the correlations for time points in which fell within the same event versus correlations for time points that fell across that event boundary. So the idea is that for time points that are in the same event, you would have a really high correlation value. For events that were across or spanning that event boundary, you would have low correlation value. And you're trying to optimize this fit essentially. So you can apply this you can apply this to different brain regions by changing the number of events that the model is allowed to arrive at. And then you can choose the optimal number of events based on this fit. So you're going to have different number of events based on this fit for different brain regions. And this is essentially their data. So this is kind of looks like an activation map. One sec. The stream is kind of lagging behind. There we go. So this kind of looks like an activation map where the colors indicate the event length, so how the duration of the event as identified by the model, where the purple colors are kind of really short events and the yellow colors are the more kind of longer events. And you can see that there's really sort of higher or shorter events in the more sensory areas like the visual cortex and the auditory cortex, where it's mostly purple, and more longer event lengths in higher order regions like the posterior medial cortex, the angular gyrus, and so on and so forth. And this is just a correlation matrix which is just depicting stable neural patterns. And once again, you can see that in the visual cortex, the stable neural pattern switches very quickly as compared to the posterior medial cortex, for instance, where the stable neural pattern or the event signature persists for a long period of time. So that's just kind of a different depiction of the same data. So that was their first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that there is going to be a sort of nested hierarchy from finer to coarser timescales, where the sensory regions are going to chunk this information based on shorter timescales, whereas the higher order regions are using more coarser timescales to identify, to sort of chunk information. So the way they kind of test this is they compared event boundaries across regions, and then also with the manual annotations that were done by their human observers. And a match in a particular region is defined as, so if the boundary in the visual cortex falls within 3 time points of the boundary identified in the posterior cingulate cortex, that is defined as a match. So what you can see here, I should get used to switching the slides before I start speaking. There we go. So what you can see here is the event, the match in each of the different regions. And you can see that there are far more events in the early visual areas compared to late visual and the posterior medial areas. But what you can also see is that there is kind of a match between the boundaries identified by the model in these higher order regions as compared to the early visual regions. So the early visual regions are essentially chunking information based on lower level visual characteristics, but these boundaries also match with the event boundaries that are identified in higher order regions, and this also matches with the human annotations. So if you remember, another hypothesis was that the higher order regions are going to most closely match the human annotations, because in these regions you see essentially these regions are chunking information similar to how we perceptually identify or understand events. So on the right hand side in this graph, you on the y-axis you essentially have match to the human annotations, and you can see that although all in the boundaries identified by in each of these regions significantly match with the human annotations, there is a significant difference between the match for the higher order regions like the posterior medial cortex as compared to the early visual region. So the posterior medial cortex is really identifying events similar to the way we perceptually understand events. The third hypothesis is that the event representation in higher order areas should be invariant to sensory modality. So no matter how you encounter a particular event, it's going to be similar between, it's going to be kind of similarly manifested in higher order regions. So if you remember, they had a data set where a subset of participants watched the movie and then also listened to an audio narration about the movie. So they essentially took the event signatures and the boundaries and from the movie viewing data and applied that to the audio recall data and calculated a correspondence between these two data sets. And what you can see over here is that the correspondence between these two data sets is really high in higher order regions like the angular gyrus and then the posterior medial cortex, as well as the temporoparietal junction. But most notably, this correspondence is almost entirely absent in the auditory cortex, which is interesting because both of these data sets have above threshold auditory activation. So you're watching the movie, there's audio associated with it, you're listening to the recall data set, you still have sort of an auditory stimulus. So the auditory cortex is getting activated in both cases, but there is, in terms of kind of the event signatures, there is almost no correspondence in the auditory cortex between these two data sets. So this invariance between sensory modalities is only observed in these higher order brain regions and not in the more sensory regions. Right. The fourth hypothesis was that the end of the event should trigger hippocampal activity. They essentially divided, they have these event boundaries in all of these different brain regions. What they did was they took these event boundaries and then sort of lined them up and looked at the average hippocampal activity at these event boundaries. So this is just like looking at kind of an event-related activation, like we do with fMRI. And what you can see is that looking at the boundaries that are derived in the angular gyrus, you see an upregulation of the hippocampal activity at these time points. The graphs are coming up. All right. So the vertical line indicates the boundaries that were identified in these regions, and the black line is indicating hippocampal activity. And you can see that there is an upregulation of this activity at these event boundaries. They comment slightly on the fact that this upregulation begins a little before the event occurs, but they explain that by saying that it's possible that the model estimation has some error. So based on that, it's possible that the event actually occurred at -10 time point, but the model estimates it slightly later. All right, the fifth hypothesis was that stored memories should be reinstated during recall. So if you remember, they had a data set where participants watched the movie and then listened to the recall. So what they did was they took the event signatures from the movie viewing data and applied that to the recall data, and then retrieved event boundaries in the recall data based on the event signatures that are derived from the movie viewing data. And then you can derive a fit and then correlate the activation of the hippocampus at these event boundaries during encoding with reactivation during recall. So in this way, you're looking at whether the hippocampus is also getting triggered when you're sort of recalling these events when you're sort of listening to a narration of the movie, the story of the movie. And you can see that there is a significant correlation. Sorry, the graph is coming up again. But based on the boundaries that are identified in the angular gyrus and then the posterior cingulate cortex, there is a significant correlation between the hippocampal response at the offset of the event during encoding, so while watching the movie, with reactivation during recall. So for subjects or for trials in which, for events in which triggered a significant hippocampal activity during recall is also associated with high hippocampal activity. Sorry, I said that the other way around. For events that are associated with high hippocampal activity during encoding, also have high hippocampal activity during recall, suggesting that the hippocampus is once again involved in reinstating these memories during recall. And then the last hypothesis is that prior memory should lead to anticipatory reinstatement. So once again, you might remember that they had a data set where participants, there was a subset of participants that watched the movie and then listened to the narration, but then they also had a set of participants who didn't watch the movie and only listened to the narration about the episode. So they essentially took derived event signatures from the movie viewing data and then applied those event signatures to the movie watching data, the audio with memory, so audio after having watched the episode, and then also applied the same event signatures to listening to participants who listened to the audio without having watched the movie first. And then they calculated a correspondence between these different data sets to look at whether you see sort of reinstatement of the event after you, in the memory data set where you already know what's coming up, as compared to correspondence between movie viewing and audio, the no memory data set. So you don't know what's coming up, and you look at whether you see reinstatement of upcoming events in this data set. And over here you can see, so this is a slightly confusing plot, but in the posterior medial cortex, for instance, you can see that, so in the in the yellow lines, so in the yellow kind of box plot, you can see that you see sort of reinstatement before the event occurs. So on the x-axis you have the audio narration, on the y-axis you have the movie in seconds. And for participants who had watched the movie before listening to the audio again, sort of showed this anticipation of what is coming up, especially in the posterior medial cortex, as compared to the participants who hadn't seen the movie before. So they're kind of listening to the story, but because they don't know what's coming up, they cannot, the neural signature for the next event does not show up in them. Whereas for participants who have seen that movie before, they are able to kind of anticipate what's coming up, and that kind of results in the manifestation of that event signature in their brain before it actually occurs. So surprise, that kind of confirms their sixth hypothesis as well, suggesting that prior memories for events can affect subsequent processing in the brain. So just to kind of, I'm not going to go too much into what this means for event processing, because I don't think any of us really study that, but the HMM can be applied to a lot of different, has a lot of different applications, I think. One of them being working memory. So if you're able to identify a kind of event signature or a neural signature for processing certain information, you can see where in the brain possibly this information is stored, when you're holding this information in your working memory, for instance, during that delay period. I feel like it might also have some application in neurofeedback, where you're looking at sort of real time, looking at event signatures, and you can kind of nudge people to reestablish that event signature in order to, I don't know, improve memory or something like that. I don't know, that's kind of sounds sci-fi-ish, but sorry, I went a lot over 15 minutes, but
well, it's okay. You had a lot of material to get through.
A lot to cover.
Yeah.
Well, our audience has been pretty quiet this evening, but it could be because this is kind of a complex topic.
It is a really complex paper, yeah.
Yeah, this is very dense.
Yeah, what I thought was really interesting, apart, like the method is obviously really cool, but in terms of the brain, what I thought was interesting was that the neural pattern seems to be so stable that it's stable across participants, which I don't know how that's possible. So it's not just that I listen to an event and you can use my event signatures to predict my own brain data, but it seems to be that they're applying the event signatures across participants, and they're able to sort of rederive those event signatures in different participants and across modalities, which I thought was also really cool.
Yeah, I'm impressed that they were able to accomplish that, because I would have thought that the first step would be to derive a subject-specific model and see if they can look at events that way first.
Yeah. Done group averaged data, which I guess kind of makes sense because each participant is contributing to that group average data. But yeah, it was really crazy.
Yeah. And you would imagine that perhaps individuals would be different in their interpretations of events for higher order areas, but perhaps not.
So the what I thought was interesting was that the manual annotation that they had people do, participants, like even in just that, I think they had like 30 participants do that, and they had people identify between I think 6 and 36 events. So there's definitely a lot of individual difference on how people perceive these events. But it seems that regardless of that, um, it seems to kind of manifest in a very stable neural pattern, I would say.
Yeah, and it was different people who did the subjective event boundaries,
Yeah.
right?
Seems like it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really confusing too.
Yeah. Also, I liked your explanation for the Markov models. I've seen the same YouTube video.
Yeah.
I'll link that in the description. It's a nice way of
I thought that was really useful, actually. That video.
Yeah.
It's called A Friendly Introduction to Markov Models and Bayesian Statistics or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is true, because this is really scary.
So
I don't even know how you go about kind of applying this or doing this, like doing the actual analysis, but just understanding it.
Yeah, and I don't think that I'll even fully understand the model without more deeply reading through the paper, but I think you did a great job of briefly introducing the different hypotheses that they were trying to look at.
Thanks. Sorry, you were saying something before?
Was I?
Do you have either you or Molly or anyone else have ideas of where else this could be kind of applicable? I thought of these two areas. I'm having a hard time kind of disassociating this method from just figuring out kind of event boundaries, because not all of us have stimuli which are sort of dynamic and like just an episode of Sherlock.
I'm not skilled enough to be able to make that kind of an assessment, but maybe Paul has an idea.
I wonder how people might use this method with EEG, because I could imagine that the events that you could use would be a lot finer in resolution.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to have long, higher order movie clips. You could show completely separate video clips or something and have people rapidly transition between events and then go back to events and see how they get reinstated. I think there's a lot of possibilities outside of fMRI, especially.
Yeah, I think so. It would also be interesting to see kind of how attention affects it. So attending to one event versus like if you have two things are happening at the same time, attending to one. Does that kind of completely get rid of the event signature of the other event, or is it still somewhere in the brain, or kind of what happens, the fate of unattended information, essentially?
Yeah. One question that I had in terms of the nested hierarchy with the different chunking of the areas, I wonder how, say, early visual areas might chunk in a different way depending on something like the physical contrast or luminance changing, and whether chunking based on such a low-level quality might influence the later higher order areas that are chunking in, I would assume, a different way.
Whether differential chunking in the visual areas would affect higher order areas?
Yeah, if that makes any sense. So, like, if they're chunking rapidly because, say, the luminance of the BBC clip is changing, is that going to be detrimental to how higher order areas are interpreting the different events?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, because perceptually, possibly it wouldn't, because I mean, if something is happening and you're just flipping the lights from green to red to green in that room, for instance, you would still be able to abstract out the event, right? Regardless of kind of the luminance in the room or
yeah, so like the intuition would be that higher order areas wouldn't be changed very much because they're interpreting based on a different criteria. But it's possible that if there is this progression from fast to short timescales, or if there's this change in information across the low to higher order areas, maybe there'd be some impact. I don't know. There's just one thing that I was thinking of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think of that.
Also, I don't really know about the posterior cingulate cortex very much, but it seems like that was important in how they were implementing the model. Could you briefly talk about the role of that area?
So I've read about, well, actually, that's more anterior cingulate cortex, but like more conflict monitoring and kind of vigilance states, if that makes sense. So kind of monitoring goal-related behavior. The posterior cingulate cortex is also, I think, considered a hub in the default mode network. So I don't know if that, I mean, what that means exactly, but is involved I think for people who consider the default mode network in this kind of rumination and or kind of mind wandering network, or is activated by these activities. I think the posterior cingulate cortex might be kind of important for I don't know, like an internal narrative, so to say.
So that might be why it's somewhat associated with this event switching.
Right. Yeah, is kind of stably coming up in these regions. They haven't actually gone much into kind of what these different brain regions do. I think they're one of their main tenets is that you get kind of consolidation into episodic memory of these different events by regulation of the hippocampus at these event boundaries. But they haven't really gone much into, because the angular gyrus is another one that comes up in most of these regions as a higher order area. But they haven't. So I don't know if the angular gyrus is kind of involved from an attention point of view or kind of speech processing. I'm not sure. But that's, yeah, I don't think they've gone much into that.
I see. All right. It doesn't seem like people are asking questions in the chat. I advise anyone who has a question before we end to, post some stuff.
Presentation would either really good or really bad.
Maybe you explain things so well that they just know.
They just understand it entirely.
Did you have a...
Yeah, I would encourage people to go through and look or watch that video that Paul said he would put into the comments, because it explains this hidden Markov model really well, and it uses a little bit of kind of numbers and calculation, but it's really good to get kind of a sense of what the model is doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. They're correct in saying that it's a friendly introduction. It will not scare you off of models.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess one last question. Did you have... which one of these 6 hypotheses did you find the most interesting?
I think the I think the multimodal one, or the fact that, I mean, it makes sense that it shouldn't matter how you're getting the information, but the brain is able to kind of abstract out the information or decouple it from the sensory information. But the fact that they were able to sort of use the data set that they have to show that. Well, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you?
I think I was most interested from like just looking at the difference in timescales from earlier to later areas, but I really appreciated how in depth they went in terms of testing multiple different theories, especially in one paper, and also the different approaches that they took in terms of the data sets used. They could have only used the Sherlock clips and then the two interleaving data sets, but they wanted to specifically look at multiple interpretations of what if you only did audio, what if you told them after they've seen the video, or different ways around that.
Yeah, definitely. I think their methods were really innovative. So having the recall narrative, and then participants either watching the movie and then listening to it, or listening to it on its own, and that was really informative in terms of kind of their hypotheses and getting at them in different ways.
Yeah. All right. Well, Molly, did you have any questions?
No, but I just noticed that we have another viewer joining us right at the end.
No.
Oh no, they missed it.
Well, if you're just joining us, we will be posting this to our page on YouTube, so that you can watch it again if you missed the presentation. And we'll be updating our website on neuro.com with the upcoming presentations. So stay tuned for that. And then if you have been a regular listener and you haven't presented yet, I think now would be a good time to send us an email with an idea of what you would like to talk about. Because I'm sure that with your interest of neuroscience, there are things, specific topics that you want to share with the world.
Yeah.
What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to add in that we were thinking of potentially changing the meeting times for On Neuro to not be on the weekends and instead be on just a random weekday that we decide on, and try and be consistent with that. For me, it's not really a big difference because I'd probably just, if it was on a weekday, I'd just stay a little bit later in lab and then present there. But I don't know what's more convenient for some people because people are busy on the weekends. And apparently the poll did not get a lot of attention. So if this is of interest to you, go fill out the poll and we might change things up a little.
Sorry, I saw that part of your email, but since my schedule for the semester isn't known yet, I didn't fill it out. So if it's okay, I will fill it out over the next couple of weeks when I figure out my teaching assignments.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I guess people figure out their next semester schedules. Maybe I should have waited a little bit, but I'll leave the poll open. Anyone can go ahead and vote maybe next month or something later on, and I'll check back in later. For the next month, I haven't decided yet. We haven't really figured out what the presentation is going to be on or who's going to do it yet, but just be aware it might be changing the times.
Okay.
All right. So I just want to thank Mrinmayi once again for the great talk, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
This was an interesting exercise.
And thank you to the people who are listening in, and have a good...
This has been an episode of On Neuro. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Is that what we're calling it? Episodes? Is this season 1?
I mean, yeah. This is a conference episode, season 1.
Yeah, and then we're gonna play back these episodes in the scanner and see what people think of them. All right. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day, night, whatever it is.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mrinmayi.